In the stillness of an English countryside night, a sudden crack of gunfire shattered the silence. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the quiet fields surrounding Osbaston House were filled with the eerie glow of flames clawing at the dark sky. By the time neighbors stepped outside, the grand mansion was engulfed, its windows bursting under the heat, its walls collapsing into fire. Inside, something unspeakable had happened, something far darker than a simple accident. No one yet knew that this blaze would expose one of the most haunting crimes in modern British history, a mystery born from success, pride, and a secret that burned with the house itself. That night, a nightmare consumed the countryside. Flames rose into the dark sky, swallowing the elegant silhouette of Osbaston House. Neighbors, terrified by the sight of fire bursting through shattered windows, dialed 999 in panic. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze had already taken full control. The mansion, a grand structure spanning more than 350 meters, was collapsing in on itself. The beams groaned and fell. The roof caved in, and what had once been a symbol of success and prestige was now an inferno. Yet something about this fire felt terribly wrong. It didn't behave like an accident. The smell of fuel lingered in the air. It was clear. Someone had poured accelerant throughout the house before it burned. The firefighters fought the flames for more than 24 hours before they could finally declare the site safe for investigation. When the heat subsided, all that remained was a skeleton of charred brick and twisted metal. On Friday, August 28th, investigators finally entered what was left of the mansion. In an annex, partially untouched by the flames, they searched carefully, but found no trace of the family. No sign of Christopher, Jill, or Kirsty Foster. The main house, however, was a different story. As forensic teams began digging through the wreckage, collapsing debris made progress slow and dangerous. The early findings painted a disturbing picture. Burned pipes, traces of oil, and chemical residue pointed to deliberate arson. But the most chilling discovery came not from the house itself, but from the nearby stables. Among the ruins, investigators found the bodies of the family's horses and dogs. None had died from smoke or fire. Each had been shot before the blaze began. Whoever did this wanted to make sure nothing and no one escaped. The mystery gripped the nation. Newspapers and television channels speculated endlessly. Where were the Fosters? Had they been kidnapped, or had they fled? 2 days later, Christopher's mother and his younger son, Andrew, visited the ruins of Osbaston House. They stood in disbelief before the smoldering remains. Police could offer little comfort. There were no signs of the family anywhere. There were no flight records, no train tickets, no evidence that they had left the country. At first, Christopher's mother clung to the hope that it was all an accident. Perhaps an electrical fault in the old wiring, but investigators quickly ruled that out. This was no accident. It was intentional, methodical, and deeply personal. Pressure on the authorities mounted as the story dominated headlines across Britain. The National Crime Agency and Scotland Yard soon joined the local police, deploying over 200 officers to comb through every inch of debris. The more they uncovered, the darker the truth seemed to become. Detectives began to ask hard questions. Could this have been revenge? A business dispute gone wrong? Christopher Foster had once been a self-made millionaire, rising from humble beginnings to a life of luxury. But his wealth had crumbled in recent years, and he had been hiding severe financial troubles. Still, his mother insisted he was a good man, disciplined, honest, and far from the criminal world. He didn't gamble, didn't use drugs, and avoided trouble. But if he truly had no enemies, what had happened inside that mansion? By now, investigators were certain the fire was deliberate. Someone had carefully orchestrated every step, and soon their fears were confirmed. During the second day of excavation, forensic teams uncovered something beneath the rubble. Human remains near the main fireplace. The bones were scorched and unrecognizable. Dental records would later confirm the worst. They belonged to Jill Foster. Yet, the autopsy revealed something even more horrifying. Jill had not died in the fire. She had been shot in the head before the blaze. Near her body lay one of the family's dogs, also killed by a bullet. As the hours passed and more debris was cleared, investigators uncovered a second charred skeleton. The forensic results confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. The second set of remains belonged to Christopher Foster. His body was discovered in the main bedroom on the first floor, lying near what was left of the bed. Close to him, buried among the ashes, was a rifle and a single partially melted bullet. As detectives puzzled over the motive, a small piece of hope came from the wreckage: the property's security system. Miraculously, several of the surveillance cameras had survived the inferno long enough to preserve their recordings. When digital forensics experts recovered the footage, what they found chilled everyone in the room. The video showed a lone man moving between the stables and the house carrying a rifle fitted with a suppressor. The images were grainy, distorted by smoke and heat, but his actions were unmistakable. The man stopped at each enclosure, raised his weapon, and fired again and again before calmly walking toward the mansion and vanishing inside. When the footage was examined frame by frame, investigators made a devastating realization. The man in the video wasn't an intruder. It was Christopher Foster himself. His build, his posture, even the clothing matched. There was no doubt left. At first, no one wanted to believe it. How could a man who seemed devoted to his wife and daughter, who had built a life of luxury and success, do something so horrific? But every new piece of evidence confirmed the same conclusion. Christopher Foster had murdered his own family and their animals before setting fire to the house. Still, there was one haunting question left unanswered. Where was Kirsty? The 15-year-old girl had been full of life. A bright student, an animal lover, and a talented swimmer and sailor. Her relatives clung to the hope that she had somehow escaped that night's horror, that she might have run out before the flames consumed the house. For 6 long days, search teams combed through the ruins. Then, deep beneath the collapsed floor of an upstairs bedroom, they found her. Kirsty's remains were discovered in what had once been her own bed. The forensic analysis told a heartbreaking story. Kirsty had not died in the fire. She was already dead before the flames reached her. Her bed had collapsed into the lower floor as the fire spread, burying her under debris. But her room had been far enough from the blaze's origin that she could have escaped if she had been alive. That realization crushed everyone who had hoped for a miracle. Kirsty's bones were so fragile from the heat that they disintegrated in the investigators' hands. Specialists had to use delicate machinery just to recover and analyze what was left. The conclusion was now unavoidable. In the early hours of August 26, 2008, Christopher Foster had made a horrifying decision. Overwhelmed by financial ruin and the prospect of losing everything he had built, he chose to destroy it all. His wife, his daughter, his home, and himself. He had killed them both quickly, shot the animals to prevent their escape, and then set the house ablaze, ensuring no one would survive. It was a final, irreversible act of control. For the police, the physical evidence was undeniable. For the public, and for those who knew the family, it was incomprehensible. How could a man once admired as a devoted husband, loving father, and self-made success turn into the architect of such devastation? Christopher Foster had not been born into wealth. He came from a working-class background, a man driven by ambition and the desire to rise above his circumstances. From a young age, he was disciplined, intelligent, and relentlessly goal-oriented. His success story began after witnessing one of the most horrific industrial disasters of the 1980s, an explosion on an offshore oil platform that claimed over 100 lives, including 2 of his own colleagues. That tragedy left a deep mark on him. Determined that such loss should never happen again, Foster threw himself into work. He developed a fire-resistant insulation material that revolutionized safety in the oil industry. It was his golden ticket. Contracts poured in, and within years, he went from factory worker to millionaire entrepreneur. He had more money than he could spend, and the image to match: confident, charming, and untouchable. In the early 2000s, during the peak of his wealth, Christopher purchased a vast estate in Mazebrook, Shropshire, for the equivalent of $3 million. He transformed the property into a personal kingdom: manicured gardens, a swimming pool, fountains, stables, and luxury cars lined up in the drive. Osbaston House was not just a mansion. It was a monument to his success, a place where he could shut out the world. But within those walls, darker habits took root. Christopher developed an obsession with guns. What began as a hobby soon became compulsion. He bought high-end rifles and handguns, storing them in nearly every room of the mansion. Friends later recalled that he spoke about firearms with pride, even reverence. His sanctuary had quietly become an armory. Then, 2 years before the fire, everything began to crumble. His company, once thriving, started to fall apart under the weight of poor decisions, tax evasion issues, and mounting lawsuits. In a desperate attempt to cut costs, he violated a contract with his British supplier by sourcing cheaper materials from the United States. His supplier sued him and won. The judgment crippled his finances, and soon his empire collapsed. By 2008, Christopher Foster was no longer a man of wealth, but a man in ruins. He was drowning in debt, nearly $5 million owed, and losing everything that had once defined him. His mansion, his business, even his reputation was slipping away. Friends began to notice the change. He had grown withdrawn, nervous, and quick to anger. Yet on the surface, he maintained the facade of success. At social gatherings, he spoke of imaginary deals and future investments. At a summer barbecue, just weeks before the tragedy, he boasted of a supposed $13 million deal with Russian investors, a complete fabrication. Behind the smiles, Christopher was collapsing internally. Investigators later discovered that he had been visiting online forums about suicide and death, searching for methods and discussing firearms. Still, he never confided in his closest circle. His mother had no idea how deep his despair ran. Just weeks before the fire, his former business partner, Pete Gerkenik, messaged him, asking if he was doing all right. Christopher replied simply, "I'm not okay." Another friend, Mark Bassett, remembered a chilling remark. When asked what he would do if the liquidators came for his home, Christopher had said, "They'll have to take me out in a box first." By late August, he was unraveling, paranoid, restless, and angry. Police psychologists would later describe him as a man who saw no way out, trapped by pride and failure. To reconstruct what happened next, forensic experts spent over 2 months analyzing the burned remains of Osbaston House. They had to rebuild skull fragments to determine how each family member died. Piece by piece, the grim puzzle of that night came together. On August 25th, 2008, the day before the fire, everything seemed normal. The Fosters attended a friendly barbecue at their neighbor's home. They laughed, joked, and joined a clay pigeon shooting session. Christopher appeared cheerful, even relaxed, the perfect family man. No one could have imagined what he was planning. Around 8:30 p.m., the family returned to Osbaston House. At 8:44, Jill entered through the main door, while Christopher went to the garage. Their daughter Kirsty let the dogs out for the night before heading upstairs. At 11:30 p.m., Christopher walked into his daughter's room and told her to go to sleep. 15-year-old Kirsty, still chatting online with friends, refused to go to bed. Irritated, her father quietly reached over and shut off her computer without saying a word before the screen went black and Kirsty managed to send one last message, joking that her father wasn't in a good mood that night. It would be the final trace of her alive. Sometime between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, Christopher first entered the master bedroom, where Jill Foster lay resting. He shot her at point-blank range. He then moved to Kirsty's room, where he killed his only daughter as she slept. By 3:10 a.m., Christopher left the house and headed toward the stables. Armed with the same rifle, now fitted with a silencer, he shot every living creature on the property. He killed 3 horses with single rounds to the head, then locked the family's dogs in their cages and shot them one by one. When he was done, he dragged their bodies into the stables and set them on fire. The night was eerily quiet. A few neighbors later recalled hearing distant gunshots echoing through the valley for about 15 minutes, but they assumed someone was out hunting. None imagined that a massacre was taking place just a few hundred meters away. Minutes later, flames began to spread. Foster used his knowledge of fire safety, the very expertise that had made him wealthy. To ensure total destruction, he pumped nearly 200 liters of oil through the house's internal piping system, saturating the floors and walls with fuel before igniting it. The fire began in the lower level, then climbed upward. Before returning to the upper floor, Christopher walked to the driveway, parked a van near the main gate, and shot out its tires, perhaps to block any rescue attempt. He then went back inside. Whether he ultimately shot himself or succumbed to smoke inhalation remains uncertain, but one thing was clear. He never intended to leave Osbaston House alive. When firefighters arrived at dawn, the mansion was a blazing skeleton. By then, every living being inside was already dead. In the days that followed, investigators began to understand the motive. A week before the fire, Christopher had received a court order for repossession. His company had collapsed, and the fortune that once defined him was gone. He was millions in debt, and the illusion of wealth he maintained for his wife and friends was crumbling fast. His wife, Jill, had no idea how dire their situation was. She stayed away from his business dealings, unaware that the family was on the brink of losing everything. He had continued spending lavishly, maintaining appearances even as creditors closed in. According to his accountant, Christopher's empire had already fallen apart. He owed nearly $5 million. His dream life, the cars, the mansion, the horses, was financed by a fantasy he could no longer sustain. In the final week, neighbors noticed that Christopher hardly left the house. He seemed distracted, moving slowly through the property as if saying goodbye. One neighbor recalled that he looked defeated, almost hollow. That night, at 3 a.m., when the flames consumed everything he had built, Christopher lay beside the lifeless body of his wife, holding her in his arms. It was a desperate, delusional act, the final gesture of a man who refused to lose control. 4 months later, the funerals took place in the local village church. Jill and Kirsty were buried together side by side. Christopher's coffin, however, was placed in a separate grave by his wife's family's request. For Jill's relatives, forgiveness was impossible. They saw Christopher as a man consumed by greed, pride, and despair. Someone who chose to destroy rather than face his own downfall. For his own family, it was the tragic collapse of a man who had reached the top and couldn't bear to fall. In the end, Christopher Foster became a symbol of self-destruction. A man who built a world of luxury, only to burn it down with everyone inside. His final act wasn't just the murder of his family. It was the ultimate confession of failure, pride, and unbearable despair. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you can be the first to hear about such real-life stories.